All right, could everyone please take their seats? If you have a cell phone, please silence it. If you're following along on Twitter, please use the official hashtag, ACS 2018. If you want CLE, then please see the brilliant young people at the door and make sure that your badge has been scanned. And I think let's begin. Okay, so let me introduce our very talented panel for today's discussion. Then I'll introduce myself. I'll say a few table-setting remarks, and then we are going to attempt to have more of a discussion among all five of us. All righty. So, ladies first, Vicki Harrison is the Executive Director of Common Cause New Mexico. Directly next to me, Lawrence Letzig is a professor at Harvard Law and the author of many books, including Republic Lost. Adam Winkler, farthest from me, is a professor at UCLA Law and the author of We, the Corporations. Jeff Clements is the CEO of American Promise and the author of Corporations Are Not People. And then my name is Chara Torres-Spelisi, and I'm the author of a book called Corporate Citizen. So my father was a visual artist and a very creative thinker, and when I was a youngster, he would say to me, Chara, remember to ask the big questions. And I think one of the big questions that all of us on this panel ask is, what is the proper role of money in an American democracy? And I think in the area of money and politics, there are two ongoing big scandals. I put them in two different buckets. One, which we saw in the 2016 election, is the problem of illegal money. And we're going to spend a lot less time on the problem of illegal money, but it looks like there was some illegal foreign money in our election in 2016, and that's a big problem. But in terms of the dollar amounts, it's a relatively small drop in the bucket, at least from what we have seen so far. What we are going to focus on is the rest of the money that's sloshing around our democracy, which is actually perfectly legal. And it's perfectly legal because of the actions of the US Supreme Court. And one of the things that the Supreme Court has done through key decisions is they have made it impossible for regulators to make certain practices in elections out of bounds. So one of the ones that's most famous and more recent is Citizens United versus FEC. That's a 2010 decision from the Supreme Court, which allows corporations and, by extension, unions, the ability to spend an unlimited amount of money on political ads in any American election, whether that's federal, state, or local. Another key seminal decision was Buckley versus Vallejo, which comes out of the 1970s. So, and the short backstory to Buckley versus Vallejo is Watergate revealed an enormous amount of campaign finance violations by Richard Nixon and others. And in response, Congress passed a law called the Federal Election Campaign Act, otherwise known as FECA. And when the Supreme Court was reviewing FECA, they split a lot of babies and made a lot of questionable law that has really strained under time. And one of the big things that the Supreme Court did in Buckley was it made expenditure limits for rich individuals out of bounds. Those are considered unconstitutional. And in that way, it is parallel to what happened in Citizens United, where the court decided that expenditure limits for corporations was constitutionally out of bounds. And so I'm going to hand it off to Jeff, and he can pick up where I hope I've left off, which is why do we actually need to amend the Constitution in light of this jurisprudence?
All right, thanks, Charan. Good to see everybody. Glad to be here with this distinguished panel. So, constitutional amendments are rare and difficult, but as Madison said, necessary in certain conditions. And the reason we need to amend the Constitution again is because we have the exact kind of conditions that the framers, including Madison, intended the amendment process to be. And these conditions are much more than campaign finance. This is not about how we get the campaign finance laws exactly perfect. This is about what the 27 other amendments were about. Fully 1/2 of our American Constitution Society, pocket constitutions, if you count the pages, half of them are amendments. So when you think of what the Constitution is and who the framers are, it's Americans throughout our history. And the reason why we need to join them in that task is because we face a constitutional choice. There has been a very well-funded, very lengthy campaign which has been successful up to this point, if we don't amend the Constitution, for a constitutional vision that I don't think people in this room want, and I know most Americans don't want. And that's a vision essentially where representation, voice, your power as a citizen turns on your access to concentrated money. And so since Citizens United in 2010, when the McCain-Feingold law was struck down, roughly $40 billion has been spent in elections. Almost all of that, as my friend Larry Lessig has pointed out so well, comes from very few sources. So it's not the amount of money, it's the concentrated power of the money. Far less than 5% accounts for most of that money. Most Americans are not participating in the number one way now that the Supreme Court has told us is the way one should participate, which is to buy access, get access to a super PAC or a capital, and have influence. Most Americans can't do that. They're excluded. So why amend? The reason it's more than campaign finance, this long-term campaign, as Chara mentioned, goes back at least to 1976 with the Buckley decision. And just to give you a sense of how rapidly this has consolidated in some of our, certainly me, lifetimes, between 1900 and 1976, there had never been a First Amendment case that struck down campaign finance laws, and particularly around the so-called and newly created right of corporations to spend money to influence elections. That had never happened. There was no First Amendment theory that said there is a right of corporations to influence the outcome of any election, state or federal, by using general treasury funds of the corporation. As Chara has pointed out in an article, she mentioned the Watergate scandal and the crimes of the president at that time. She has an excellent law review article I commend to you that we have forgotten. They were also crimes of corporations. Over a dozen corporations, major corporations in the American economy, pleaded guilty to crimes for funneling money to influence the outcome of elections. Not one of them raised a defense saying that they had a right to do that. They knew it was illegal. There was no view that there was a right to do that at that time. In the last Gilded Age, much like our own, where economic power concentrated and turned into political power, we fought back with amendments, but also with anti-corruption laws, state and federal, that got corporate money out of elections. It sought to. 1948, Taft-Hartley added unions because of the risk of concentrated capital corrupting the political process. So what's happened between 1976 and now is something new in American history. And we have the Buckley case, we have Citizens United, which overturned 2 Supreme Court cases holding that the campaign finance laws do indeed, the American people do indeed have the power to exclude corporate and union money from elections. But we also have a line of cases that Adam has in his book so well about new corporate rights. I was involved in a case when I was at the AG's office in Massachusetts that went to the Supreme Court called Lorillard versus Riley. Tom Riley was the Attorney General. It was in the early 90s, holding that the Lorillard Tobacco Company had a First Amendment right to target children with cigarette ads, and struck down a Massachusetts regulation that tried to contain that. Now, literally, they didn't say that, of course. They put it as corporate speakers have to be free to speak, et cetera. But effectively, it was the facts came out of a context in which they were targeting children with Joe Camel ads and things like that. The Central Hudson case, which is the commercial speech case, many of you are no doubt familiar with, about when commercial or corporate speech is allowed, was right around when I was getting out of law school, 87, 88. So this is new stuff. And what the constitutional stakes are isn't about, corporate law, and it's not about campaign finance law. It's about the traditional thing that all amendments are about, which is how do you define the rights of a citizen in a republic, and how do you define the kind of constitutional norms that can ensure self-government of equal citizens who have vastly different means economically actually works. And so if you look at the whole constitutional history, it is a story of moving away from and combating the equation of concentrated wealth with political power. That was what the revolution was about. We're not going to be an aristocracy. We had property white males who had equal citizenship, not others. Our whole constitutional story has been trying to move towards we're going to be equal citizens, and we have to be really cautious about concentrated economic power having undue influence, or we will lose this American promise, American experiment. And so we've lost. Citizens United and McCutcheon is another case, the Arizona Free Enterprise case, striking the Montana case, struck down all the anti-corruption laws that were passed in the turn of the century, the state anti-corruption laws like Montana had, that's gone. 29 states had those kind of laws. Aggregate limits on funding candidates, federal candidates gone in the Montana case. Citizens are United, of course, opening the door to unlimited spending as long as you are, quote unquote, doing it independently of the campaigns. A massive, rapid shift towards concentrated economic power having unprecedented political power. So we either accept it and it gets worse and worse, or we amend the Constitution. And the pathway of the Constitution is hard, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But the goal of the constitutional amendment is not just to overturn cases, but to move forward with a vision of equal citizenship and checks and balances in a republic. The outlines of it, and I hope we'll get into what that might look like, have been foreshadowed very well in the dissents in those cases, most of which were 5-4 dissents with powerful contrary visions to what the constitutional vision of the majority in Citizens United has. So it's about political equality, it's about equal representation, it's about a well-functioning republic where people matter as much as money in coming to the electoral and political sphere.
Okay. Larry, you ran for president. Did that experience inform how you think about whether an amendment is necessary, or are those two divergent topics in your mind?
Well, first, I want to build off of just what Jeff just said at the very end. I've paid my dues in the money in politics fight, and so don't doubt that I'm deeply committed to the objective of eliminating the corrupting influence of money in our politics. But I think, as Jeff was suggesting at the end of what he was saying, we need to recognize there's a more fundamental problem here than money in politics. And the more fundamental problem is that we have allowed our institutions to develop so that we don't have a representative democracy anymore. Now, one way we don't have it is the corruption of money in politics. And that's a critical, obvious flaw that absolutely every American, except the lobbyists in this city, get. But that's not the only flaw. So the way we gerrymander districts guarantees that certain people have less political rights than other people. The stupidly insane way we elect our president guarantees that the 14 swing states, which got 99% of presidential spending in the campaigns in 2016, have enormous power in our political system, and the other states do not. And then the most fundamental to me, the one that's so outrageous, the idea that states can self-consciously suppress the votes of some of their citizens and openly suppress the votes of some of their citizens because we don't have a constitutional right to vote is another way in which we've allowed inequality to be baked into the very DNA of our so-called democracy. So I support the idea of an amendment to achieve the fundamental objective of representational integrity, or as you were describing it, equal citizenship. I think that is the fight we ought to be talking about, and then talk about all the dimensions of it. So one dimension is a right to vote, to guarantee that these stupid systems to eliminate the opportunity of especially minorities to vote are unconstitutional. Secondly, gerrymandering reform, which, we obviously need an intervention, even if the Supreme Court helps in the next couple of weeks. The end of private funding of public campaigns, that ought to be part of what an amendment demands, and a way to deal with the ridiculous way we elect our president. Those are the elements. But my commitment has always been that we actually can do an extraordinary amount without a constitutional amendment. And we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So I wholeheartedly support the work of groups like American Progress that have been doing powerful rallying of people on both sides of the political spectrum around this fundamental equal citizenship point. And I and my own organization, Equal Citizens, so it's a surprising name here, okay, but Equal Citizens have been litigating around constitutional principles to try to bring these constitutional ideas up to date in this sense. But I also think we can't let the politicians off the hook. We've got to demand, especially those of us, whatever your party is, you've got to demand your party take the lead in real reform that would bring about equality in our political system, including fundamentally changing the way we fund campaigns, establishing an equal right to vote so that this suppression can no longer happen, addressing gerrymandering, which Congress has a constitutional authority to do, and pushing the understanding of the complete failure, which is the Electoral College right now.
Okay. Vicki, representing some of the grassroots activists at Common Cause, what is the appetite for amending or not amending?
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for having me. I feel like I should have written a book before I got here. And then we also get to follow the justice. So, wow, I appreciate you guys coming to talk about something as sexy and exciting as campaign finance reform after that speech. The appetite of state activists, that's what I do. I work at the state legislature level to do just as Lawrence said, pass all these reforms. This is not a one thing. I mean, people talk about, you're just trying all these different ways because you don't know what path it's going to actually take. That is so untrue. It's because it's going to take them all. People come to this issue from all walks of life. At Common Cause New Mexico, we do polling every year. And so just for an example with disclosure, the courts have said we can require limited disclosure. I mean, in the Citizens United decision, 8-1 disclosure, and then they've kind of whittled that down, and it can be a little bit. The regular citizens in New Mexico, 92% of them want every single penny disclosed. We also do polling with our business organizations with an organization called Committee for Economic Development. The business numbers on whether it's voting reform or public financing or lobby reform, disclosure, all of those things, literally year after year, from Republicans, independents, Democrats, poll in the 85 to 100%. Gerrymandering, it depends on who's been in control in your state for a long time, whether or not you're going to get any support on gerrymandering. I can tell you, as somebody who's from a state where the Democrats have controlled the House and the Senate for a long time, they give you like a 3-committee assignment on redistricting, and we have 60-day sessions, so you can imagine how well those bills go. And I think the appetite is just there. People want it. People think that this is just ridiculous. In the Arizona Free Enterprise case, the courts literally said public financing is not about leveling the playing field. Okay, when I say that to a group of non-attorney activists, regular folks, they bust out laughing because they're like, of course public financing is to level the playing field. That's exactly what it's about, to give somebody who doesn't have that donor list an opportunity to even run for office. And so I just think that the appetite is there, Chara. People want it, and people are a lot smarter than we think they are. We think they're sitting around drinking Budweiser and watching hockey. Just kidding. But they're paying attention. We do focus groups all over the state in rural Republican areas, and what came out of Roswell, New Mexico just last week is wow. And this is from, the homemaker who's 34 years old and never been to college and is way smarter about these issues, ethics, public financing, disclosure, and real information. I mean, I came into this work after Citizens United, and I can remember a brilliant attorney looking at me because, Citizens United. And he said, you know what, Vicki? Things weren't exactly rosy the day before Citizens United. We have this little thing called Buckley from back in the day. So I went and read that, and I was like, oh, wow. So there is a lot to do, and people are tired of just piecemeal, I want this little bit, I want that little bit. Larry is absolutely right. People want it all. I mean, I'll finish with this. I was talking to a group of young folks after the 2016 election about primary elections. And they were like, Vicki, this doesn't even make sense. So you're saying that every state has their own rules. Some are open primary, some are partial open, some have a caucus. So that you're literally comparing apples to oranges by the time we get to the general election. There is so much reform to be done, and that's what we're doing in the states every single day while we wait for Congress to get off their ass and do something.
All right. So a panoply of democratic reforms have been offered by our panelists, but if I can steer us back to, I think, our original charge, Adam, if the problem is Citizens United, is a constitutional amendment required, or can changes in election law or changes in corporate law address some of those issues?
Well, it's a great question, Char. Thank you for having me, and a great honor to be with this panel as well. And so nice of Justice Sotomayor to set up our big performance here tonight with our opening act. I hope you like the opening act. Yeah. So, I mean, Citizens United poses a series of problems. I mean, Citizens United holds not only the corporations have the same free speech right as individuals to spend their money on election ads, but it also is a very bold and broad ruling for the ability of anyone, corporations, unions, or individuals, to spend unlimited independent expenditures that are not coordinated with candidates. And I put coordinated in quotes because that's really where they belong, because there really is a lot of coordination that, so long as it's not any kind of official or formal coordination, goes under the radar. And both of those are significant issues, and we shouldn't focus on one and not the other. So there's been discussion about a corporate personhood amendment. We'll talk about some potential different amendments as we move on in our panel. But there's been corporate personhood amendments that would propose to eliminate all rights for corporations. That would solve perhaps one part of Citizens United, the fact that corporations have the same free speech right to spend their money, but wouldn't solve the Sheldon-Adelson problem. Remember 2012, and Sheldon-Adelson spent $90 million or something to support Mitt Romney, thanks to Citizens United and how that case was interpreted by the lower courts in the wake of the decision. And that's a big part of the problem. You need to address both of those problems. And can it be done through mechanisms other than a constitutional amendment? I actually think the constitutional amendment may be the hardest way to figure out how to do it, because a constitutional amendment shouldn't be, when it's talking about principles of democracy and freedom and equal citizenship, should be broad. It should be general. It can't be too much like a code, like a statute. And when you talk about corporations and restricting corporations, you really kind of need more of a statute, because there's a lot of different kinds of corporations, and there's a lot of corporations that you think, well, I'm opposed to corporations, but you really don't want the New York Times not to have any constitutional rights and to be subject to censorship. So you need to kind of make these distinctions. You want Planned Parenthood or the Sierra Club, both corporations, not to lose their rights in a constitutional amendment. So it might be difficult to solve that problem through a constitutional amendment. And a constitutional amendment that allows broader campaign finance regulation, of course, has the problem that it doesn't actually solve the problem itself so much as enable Congress to solve the problem if it wishes to. And as Vicki just pointed out, Congress is not about to solve any of these problems. So it is a difficult issue. Some of the issues can be addressed, I think, statutorily, but it's going to be very difficult with the current Supreme Court and the current doctrine. I think sort of the best hope for overturning a case like Citizens United, if a constitutional amendment, if it's too difficult to get that constitutional amendment, is really through changing the membership of the United States Supreme Court. And I think actually that we came very, very close to seeing Citizens United overturned. I think if Merrick Garland were on the court instead of Justice Gorsuch, I think there's a very good chance that Citizens United would have been, if not overturned, very severely limited in its reach by the new court. Obviously, the court's not going in that direction now, but I do think that you play the long game. You got to think about this in 10, 20 years. I think that probably the most likely possibility for reform in the area, not going to come from Congress, but may come from a change in personnel on the court in time.
I sense that Jeff wants to respond.
I do, and I agree with much of what Adam said. However, Merrick Garland is not on the court, right? So the question is, what do we do? If anyone has a reasonable proposal that this Supreme Court will be the kind of Supreme Court that's going to overturn Citizens United in any foreseeable time, let me know, because amendments are hard, and I have other things I could do if I thought the court was going to do it. I don't think they are. They have had their chance in this current configuration. A Supreme Court case came up from Montana that upheld the 100-year-old Montana Anti-Corruption Act, which had prohibited corporate money in elections, upheld by the Supreme Court of Montana, with a very deep record of the corrupting effects of corporate money in Montana elections, and before they had this law, and went to the Supreme Court, summarily reversed without a hearing, despite the fact a Supreme Court of a state had held otherwise. Two interesting things happened. One, my favorite state court judge now, Justice Jim Nelson of the Montana Supreme Court, retired from the court and joined our board and is hard at work on an amendment. But the second interesting thing illustrates Adam's point. In a remarkable, summarily reversed usually means the court is trying to send a message that we are holding our line, we're unified, this case will stand, so stop this mischief of trying to get us to overturn it. And you would try to do it 9-0, or at least 8-1, if they're going to send that kind of message. This summary reversal was 5-4, and not only 5-4, with a separate opinion, I think written by Justice Breyer, saying we should have taken this case and overturned Citizens United. So that's how close it is. But let's think about this amendment. This is not some long-term thing that may happen someday. It's underway. 19 states have passed amendment resolutions, the most recent being New Mexico with Vicki and Common Cause's help twice. 800 cities and towns have done it. There's 44 sponsors for the amendment in the House. There's 170 in the Senate. I'm sorry, thank you. The Senate doesn't have 200. Yeah. Right. Thank you, Steve. Yes, the Senate, which has, we need 67. You need 2/3 of the Congress. 67 senators. We have 44. We need 290 House members. We have 170. So this is game on. The other thing I want to say, though, about, of course, the amendment won't do everything, and of course, Vicki is right. We have to do everything. But the amendment is essential, and here's why. We cannot pass laws, no matter how much political will we have, about dealing with systemic corruption, or even increasingly with outright corruption. If you wonder why politicians keep getting acquitted despite what appears to be, I used to say, you'd have to give a bag of cash to a politician to get a corruption case conviction nowadays, because of the way the Supreme Court has redefined corruption to not mean anything. I think now you could give a bag of cash. That was essentially the Virginia governor and Menendez were not that far from bags of cash, and the instructions on corruption are so narrow because of this court that basically we've redefined what corruption means in the country. You cannot impose limits on corporate or union or billionaire spending to influence the outcome of elections. Most Americans, most business executives, just about anyone in America literally believes we have to have reasonable limits or free speech rights of other people are drowned out and we lose our right to representation. So if we don't have an amendment, it really is, as Adam said, the court better do it. If you don't think the court's going to do it, we better get to work on an amendment because we won't be able to do many of the things, not all of them, but many of the things that we need to do. Final point, if I could, is Ruth Bader Ginsburg has come up a lot recently, and one thing I love about her life story is one of her early cases as a lawyer was arguing the equal rights of women under the Equal Protection Clause and Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, challenging laws that said women can't do certain things, such as be an executor of an estate, if a man was available to do it. Literally, those were state laws. That one went to the Supreme Court, and it was one of the wins, big wins that she had, was to succeed on that theory. But that win only came after many losses of other women who had made those arguments, and the Supreme Court had said the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment actually doesn't mean that. And what was going on then? The fight for the Equal Rights Amendment was going on. They were fighting for an amendment. They were winning 2/3 of Congress. It fell short, the Equal Rights Amendment, by 2 states of ratification. But the Supreme Court pays attention to when the country is having an amendment fight. And so I think this amendment conversation that we're having is so important, not only because I believe we will win this amendment, but it can also be a way the Supreme Court interacts with the American people to get their judgments right after they've gotten them wrong for a long time. So, we don't know who will be the Ruth Bader Ginsburg who will bring a case to the court that will overturn the Citizens United if the amendment is going on. But I do believe if that happens, it'll be because we fought the amendment fight. Personally, I think we'll win the amendment before the court will overturn it. But either way, we get there.
Right. I just pipe in and just say that no, I think that's right. I think that the advantage of a constitutional amendment is it's a very good mobilization tool. A tool for mobilizing people, getting people excited about this issue, get discussion on the issue. I don't think practicality, I think actually my view is just diametrically opposed in terms of the practicality. I just think if we can't get the Disclose Act passed by Congress, you're not getting past the Senate filibuster on a constitutional amendment that the Republican Party is dead set against being passed. So I'm not as hopeful about the constitutional amendment because of the current status, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't pursue a constitutional amendment. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be fighting for those values. Because I do think how you ended it was exactly what I was going to respond. It's like when you think about the ERA, these constitutional amendment fights, very difficult to amend the Constitution. We haven't really done a good job of it in a long, long time. And the amendments basically since the New Deal have all been pretty minor constitutional amendments with 1 or 2 exceptions. And I think that the vibrant movement and mobilization to fight for constitutional values can shape legal attitudes going forward and influence the justices. I definitely agree with Jeff. No chance this Supreme Court is going to overturn Citizens United. But if we are talking about amending the Constitution, presumably we're doing it because we want to take care of America for the next 100 years, right, for the future. And so if our timeline really is a longer timeline, I don't think we should be too focused on the fact that there's a 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court today that's hostile to campaign finance law. These things do change, and sometimes, as we learned in November, the direction of the court can change kind of in an instant from what we really expect.
So there's another part about this amending through the Supreme Court, though, that I think we should flag. The right tried to amend the abortion right through the Supreme Court. And since Reagan on, the Republican Party said they were going to appoint justices who were going to overturn the abortion right. And when that finally came to a head in the Casey decision, the most striking opinion in that decision was the joint opinion, where the justices basically said, hey, we are not going to be used in this way. We're not going to allow the court to amend the Constitution through this political process, because if you want to amend the Constitution, there's a way to do it, and we are not going to be the means to achieving that. I thought that was an incredibly important decision. And so it really troubles me when people on my side, because obviously I don't agree with Citizens United, I don't agree with Speech Now, but when we start saying, okay, now we're going to amend the Constitution by appointing the justices who are going to change the rules as the rules have been articulated. Even if you think those rules are wrong, what we should be doing is not identifying the fact that we're winning by appointment as opposed to winning by principle. And it's the principle that I think should lead us to overturn those decisions. And while I completely agree Citizens United is not going to be overturned, I'm going to bet with you that we're going to get Speech Now overturned in the next 2 years. But that's a completely separate argument. The second point about this, though, the thing that frustrates me the most about the court-centric focus is that we on this side of the debate have done such a terrible job in building the democratic movement for democracy. Like, we have been so used to the idea that every problem will be solved by racing to the Supreme Court and getting 5 justices to agree with us. And so the idea of what Common Cause is doing, and I think what Jeff is doing through American Promise, of like getting real people engaged in the fight for democracy, is where I think our focus has got to be. Because if you don't have tens of millions of people out there screaming for it, it's not going to happen, especially when all the money in the world is against it, which, of course, here in this city, all the money in the world is against exactly this kind of reform.
And just so we're all clear, and just in case there are non-lawyers out there watching this, the reason that we're talking about either the Supreme Court reversing or a constitutional amendment is that the Supreme Court has ruled in campaign finance law cases on First Amendment grounds. They are making constitutional law when they make these rulings, which means that the only way to get rid of Citizens United is a future Supreme Court case reverses Citizens United, or same with Buckley, a future case reverses Buckley, or we amend the Constitution to change the law that governs how the court will look at future cases.
And let me just make sure we have this on the table. So far, we've been speaking about one mode of amendment. This is a little bait and switch for me because I was invited to this panel because there's another way of proposing amendments to the Constitution that I'm really eager that we get a chance to discuss, which is the Article 5 convention mode of proposing amendments to the Constitution, and that produces a whole different set of politics.
Okay. Well,
can I jump in real quick and just say
yeah, go ahead.
That, I, for one, would take the results that abortion foes have gained over the last 40 years in the area of political corruption. Like, if we could do as good a job fighting against abortion as they have, even though they haven't overturned Roe versus Wade in its entirety, that would be a tremendous move in the direction of democratization and equality. So it would be a partial move, but I don't think that's, and I don't know that that's the right analogy either. Liberals did really aggressively amend the Constitution over the last 3 years to protect the right of same-sex marriage. I don't think it has undermined the ability of liberals to make claims about democracy, and I think it really shows there's promise in the courts. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we're still dealing with right now, and it's in our newspaper every day, is that the Obama administration came into office with that attitude that the courts don't matter that much. And so they didn't put the political capital behind judicial nominations. They weren't willing to fight, go to the mat for judicial nominees that had a real progressive attitude about the law. And the result is that they got very moderate people appointed to the courts, and we're seeing now the Federalist Society is incredibly active at filling the courts. They see that the courts are really important. Whatever constitutional amendment you adopt, whatever statute you adopt, those 9 people across the way over there are going to have the final say. Stop ignoring the courts.
Okay. And I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, please do.
Because, gosh, I'm a talker, too. I usually have no problem jumping in. Lord have mercy, huh? So, first of all, as somebody working in a state, we hardly ever think about the Supreme Court. For attorneys, y'all will enjoy this. We're in the 10th Circuit in New Mexico, and so we like to say the 10th Circuit makes the Supreme Court look like progress now on campaign finance law. This is a circuit who said back in 2015 that a PAC can be coordinated and uncoordinated at the same time. All they have to do is keep their money in 2 separate bank accounts. That's what I deal with in New Mexico. In the Citizens United ruling, everybody talks about the 8-to-1 disclosure. You know, of course we'll have disclosure. We don't have disclosure in New Mexico. I've been fighting that since Citizens United. We finally got some rules and regulations through our Secretary of State's office. The word coordination is not even in our state statute. And so I think it's just the idea that we would, you know, really put our faith in the Supreme Court or just our faith in Congress or the Senate. We don't have faith in them. The public doesn't. I mean, I just did another focus group on an ethics commission, and the people literally said, you know, this might work if it's made up of people from Canada. I'm not lying. I mean, people, there's like zero trust. You know, back in the day, we thought Congress was corrupt except for our guy or our gal. They're good, everybody else sucks. No. Now everybody sucks all the time. I mean, our polling numbers for your local politicians are going in the toilet. They're dealing with the congressional blowback. When Congress is now literally telling people, I spend 75% of my time dialing for dollars. I mean, I can remember somebody from New Mexico, she won her first congressional race. I ran into her the day after the election. And she said, oh my God, Vicki, my people are telling me I have to raise $1 million before the end of the year, before I take office for next term. And she was just like, this is not why I got into this. And so I think it's going to take a lot of different ways and different people, and it's going to take, you know, the power of the people. And that's one of the reasons I love working at Common Cause in the states with so many great national and state partners, whether it's my law community or business community or faith community. People want this done, and people understand how this undermines our democracy and makes no matter what other issue you care about is not getting a fair shake. So if you care about children or women or the environment, hell, if you care about super PACs, I mean, I always say that, you know, a real democracy is going to allow everybody to speak. We're not trying to stop corporations from speaking. They're people too. They can speak. But everybody should have a chance at the microphone.
Okay. Jeff, if we are amending the Constitution, what would the substance of that amendment be? Is it something that tries to get rid of dark money? Is it something that stops our members of Congress from turning into telemarketers? Is it trying to tamp down on corporate spending? Is it all of that?
Well, no, it's not all of that, because a lot of those are the kind of detail that are really better suited to a statute than the Constitution. I know Larry quite rightly wants to get to how do we do it and what are the different means of doing it. So I'll just be real quick, and I'll read the amendment that has the 44 senators. It's led by Tom Udall of New Mexico, and that has 170 sponsors in the House. It's not the only one. We're doing at American Promise and the American Constitution Society. We're leading a national project, a series of town halls. Grateful that people on this panel have been part of it, called Writing the 28th Amendment, where we're taking this on the road. It's the first amendment in the digital age. We think every American can be at the table as to what it says. But here's the current language. We think it needs to get finalized, certainly by a vote just after the 2020 election. So we have, 18 months to get it right. If you want to get involved in the project, let me know, or go to AmericanPromise.net. Here's Tom Udall's amendment. Section 1, to advance democratic self-government and political equality, and to protect the integrity of government and the electoral process, Congress and the states may regulate and set reasonable limits on the raising and spending of money by candidates and others to influence elections. The key phrases: political equality, integrity of government and the electoral process. Those are the constitutional concepts that the Supreme Court says are not now justified reasons to have reasonable regulations on money spent in our elections. Section 2 says Congress and the states shall have the power to implement and enforce this article by appropriate legislation, which is where we'll get those others. If we build the kind of movement necessary to get an amendment, we will certainly have the kind of political power to get some good laws to follow it. Section 2, Congress and the states shall have the power to implement and enforce this article by appropriate legislation, and may distinguish between natural persons and corporations or other artificial entities created by law, including by prohibiting such entities from spending money to influence elections. So Section 2 is dealing with the corporate issue by basically saying it doesn't violate the Constitution to have different rules for corporations and human beings in this context of electoral spending. And Section 1 empowers the states and Congress, i.e. the people, to enact regulations and limits on spending in elections in order to serve the constitutional purpose of the equal rights of Americans, political equality, and the integrity of our electoral process and government process.
Okay.
So,
Are there any friendly amendments to Jeff's amendment?
Tom Udall's amendment.
Yes.
No, we love it. We insisted on the word reasonable, and Senator Udall made sure that word was in there for us. That was one of our sticking points, because I have a lot of nervous attorneys in New Mexico who are like, oh, wait a minute, if we let incumbents write laws on, they'll make contribution limits $5 and expenditures $20, and they're going to run the place. So we wanted to make sure the word reasonable, so we're pretty happy with it.
So I know you've been chomping at the bit to get at the process. So the amendment process that I think we are most familiar with is that 2/3 of both houses propose an amendment and then send it to the states for ratification. Would you like to summarize the other way that we can amend the Constitution?
Sure. So Article 5 also says that 2/3 of the states can call on Congress for the purpose of proposing a convention for the purpose of proposing amendments, which are also valid only if they are ratified by 3/4 of the states. So the first really important law professor quibble here is we have a history in America of a constitutional convention. That's the convention in 1787, which gave us our Constitution. Article 5 is not talking about a constitutional convention. It's talking about a convention that has a single power to propose amendments. And it explicitly says those amendments are not valid unless they're ratified by 3/4 of the states. So it's a new kind of convention, although there are similar ones the states have adopted, which has never yet existed in America. But again, echoing Adam's point about the effect of rallying, there's a good argument that every single major amendment to the Constitution since the beginning has been induced because of the threat of an Article 5-like convention. The Bill of Rights itself came because the Anti-Federalists said they wanted another convention to deal with rights. All of the Civil War amendments, of course, had a civil war in addition to the amendments, so that's a little bit different. But the most dramatic was the amendments that gave us elected Senate. The states were within 1 or 2, depending on how you count it, of calling for a convention to propose an amendment to deal with the way senators were elected, and that terrified Congress. So Congress then immediately sent out an amendment after resisting it for more than 20 years. So this has been a mechanism for inducing the proposal of amendments, which is a little different from the mechanism for producing the Supreme Court to get it right. And at the very least, I think that could have the same effect here.
And just a little historical reminder, part of what inspired the 17th Amendment, which gave us the direct election of senators, was the atrocious election of W.A. Clark from Montana, where it was so clear that there was bribery involved, in part because Mr. Clark would sign his envelopes that he bribed the Montana legislature with. So, Adam, what are some of the pros and cons of going the convention route?
Well, I think a lot of people have a significant hesitation about a convention to propose amendments, in part because I think there's a lot of concern that the values that we've articulated, that we think the panelists here have articulated as important values to add to the Constitution, might not be the ones that come out of that convention, and seem actually more likely not to be the ones that come out of such a convention. So, I mean, one thing to remember is fighting against political corruption, money in politics, these are really important issues to a very small number of people. Polling indicates that, yes, a lot of people oppose Citizens United, But when you look on election day, is money in politics or campaign finance reform an important issue for voters? It's way down the list. It's important to always recognize in a democracy the difference between the breadth of support and the intensity of support, because they're two very, very different things. You can find polling data that says 90% of the people support overturning Citizens United, or, I don't know, changing our gun laws, or revising the Second Amendment, or whatever it is. But the question is not whether how many people support that. It's how much those people support it. And what we've seen, for instance, in the gun debate, for instance, is that the 10 or 15% of Americans who are really intense pro-gun advocates are much stronger than the 85% of people who are relatively mildly in favor of gun control, think we should do more. Because the people on the gun control side lack the intensity. So where's the intensity in American politics? Is it about money in politics? Or is it about abortion? Is it about gay rights? Is it about transgender rights? Is it about affirmative action? My skepticism is that a constitutional convention is going to result in a series of values that I don't support coming out of them, and a series of amendments that would more strictly limit Congress's power to regulate the economy. More strict restrictions on the ability of Congress to interfere with the powers of states. More serious restrictions on the ability of states to protect abortion rights. So my fear is that the Constitutional Convention it's too unwieldy. It leads to any kind of amendment being proposed, and I'm concerned about what amendments might come out of that process. I could be wrong in my prediction. It's just a prediction, but when I look out there, I just don't see the money in politics issue as one of high intensity and great public salience. It's one that there's a lot of weak support for, and I think weak support means it doesn't come out of that Constitutional Convention with a very good amendment.
And Vicki, you talked about your perspective as coming from New Mexico and the difference between thinking about this from the state perspective as opposed to the federal perspective. Do you think the states would feel better about this process if it was the states themselves that called the convention?
You know, I don't think so. You know, when this issue came up in New Mexico on a variety of levels, there's different Article 5s. There's Article 5s on money and politics, and then there's also the, you know, the balanced budget and convention of states and all these different ones. And, you know, when all of the social justice organizations I work with come to me about a democracy bill and say, hey, do you know what just got dropped over here? It's like, whoa, wait a minute. And, you know, so... You know, there's hundreds of organizations that, as Adam says, are very concerned about this path, and that are very concerned because of the lack of what might happen there, and the current political climate that we're under, and you know, the people that are in power, whether they're in the states or in Congress, or at the Supreme Court, or at the president level. We don't trust any of them. And the idea of all these folks who are making their living off corporate money and have gotten to where they are by spending 75% of their time dialing for dollars, suddenly being able to play around in our Constitution makes people incredibly nervous.
Jeff, which path would you choose if you could choose a path?
Well, I'm interested in Professor Lessig's response on the convention issue. At American Promise, we have members on both sides of this debate, and what we say is, look, if you're concerned about a convention, get to work on getting those 67 votes in the House and 290 in the Senate. I got it backwards again, 290 in the House, 67 in the Senate. I usually say it right to them. And then we will all be on the same side getting ratification. And to those who are pushing for the convention, they make a case, and as Larry mentioned, it's a historically tested case that Congress is usually compelled to do something like an amendment that they don't want to do because of the threat of a convention, and I think that dynamic has not changed. You know, an all-male, unelected Senate didn't pass 2 amendments by 2/3, including the right of women to vote, and have to go back and face election because they wanted to. They were compelled to. And let me just finish on responding to Adam's point about obviously that kind of dynamic assumes that people actually really care and they're really fighting for this. And I think it's an out-of-date data point to look at polls saying, oh, well, people say they are for reform or campaign finance reform, but they don't really care that much about it. I think Americans care passionately about it, and that there's some sense of resignation about nothing can be done about it. That's different. And I think what we're seeing, if we look at, are we in an amendment kind of moment, they happen not when times are good or times are stable. They happen when things are falling apart. And they happen in bunches. And I think we're in that era. So I don't look to polls, although if you did, you'd see massive support for this. 84% of Janesville, Wisconsin residents, Paul Ryan's hometown, voting for this is not unusual. It happens over and over again. But if you look at how the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are falling apart, it's over this issue. It's over corruption. If you look at some of what led to the election of Donald Trump, if you look at the Civil War, essentially, that's too strong a word, I shouldn't say that, the debate between Bernie Sanders people and Hillary Clinton people, the debate within the Republican Party with the Tea Party people and Mitch McConnell, it is a debate about money and power and corruption. So, I think it's game on, and let's get the game right. The convention issue is a real complicated one, and that's why I'm dodging it and turning it to Larry Lessig.
All right, Larry.
Well, so first, completely agree that the conventional wisdom that the public doesn't care about this issue is 20th century wisdom about the public not caring about this issue. There is an intense passion around this issue, as there was an amazing study done in the middle of 2016 by University of Maryland, finding the highest level of dissatisfaction in the history of polling with their government, and the level of intensity as high as they've ever seen. And when you ask the reasons people are so angry, the 80%, 90% reasons people give are things like the influence of money in politics, the fact that Congress cares only about the lobbyists and the parties, not about the public, all of these representational issues. And then when you look at the difference between Republicans and Democrats, there is no statistical difference between Republicans and Democrats about this issue. They even broke it out among intense Trump supporters versus intense Clinton supporters. And if anything, the intense Trump supporters were more supportive of reform than the intense Clinton supporters. But I don't even think there was a statistical difference there. So there is deep passion about it. What there isn't is any sense that there's anything to be done about this. We did a poll. We found 96% of Americans thought it important to reduce the influence of money in politics. 91% didn't think it was possible. Now, that's the politics of resignation. And, ask anybody from Egypt under Mubarak or under the current government. It's like, you want a different world, but if you don't think there's any reason to be fighting for it, you're not going to be fighting for it. And so what we have to do is to give them a reason to fight for it. Now, the only thing I am skeptical about in what Jeff has said, and the one thing that I'm really maybe strongly agreeing with what Adam has said, is the likelihood of these different methods for fixing the constitutional problem that I think we all agree is on the table. So, before the last election, one would have thought amending the Constitution through the Supreme Court was the most likely path. That's not going to happen, except for my case that I'm not going to talk about. But, we'll put that aside. That's just not going to solve the problem. So then we say, well, Congress proposing an amendment. And as hopeful as I am that I'm wrong, and as strongly as I can support Jeff in his work, I'm with Adam. The idea that you're going to find 24 Republicans in the United States Senate to support an anti-Citizens United bill would seem possible if you could show me one. But we don't even have one. So, we've got a long way to go to imagine a United States Senate that is proposing an amendment. So if it's not the court and not the traditional method, then what is there? The only other path is this path through the convention. Now, the response to that is, well, the convention might propose amendments I don't like. And I'm sure the convention is going to propose amendments I don't like. But, it takes 38 states to ratify the amendment. And in a democracy, if you're not willing to allow a 3/4 filter to pick what should be part of our Constitution, I think we've given up the idea of popular sovereignty in a Constitution. We can say we don't like what they can come up with, but if we're committed to the idea of a popular sovereignty, what I think we should instead say is, let's fight for the right constitutional result. And I'm happy to have an argument about balanced budget or defending a woman's right to choose or defending the right to citizenship on the basis of birth. I'm happy to have that fight, and I'm absolutely certain we get at least 13 states, just 13 states, or better than that, just one House in 13 states to agree with us. Because that's a value, those values are so fundamental in our tradition right now. So given I think we can avoid all the bad, and I don't see any other way to get a chance to do the good, I don't see we can just throw this option out as something that's not going to be considered. And I'm so grateful American Promise, which originally began much more committed to the constitutional path, has become very open to encouraging the conversation about which of these different paths makes sense.
So I'm going to bring this maybe full circle to where I started, which is, it feels to me like we are in a Watergate-type moment. Watergate leads to the resignation of Richard Nixon and the passage of FECA, the Federal Election Campaign Act. We don't know how this story is going to end with the special counsel, though he did put in a superseding indictment right before we got on stage against Paul Manafort. I'll ask this to the whole panel. Is there reform, is this a reform moment like the Watergate moment? Go for it, Vicki.
Absolutely. Before I came over here, we actually had Representative Liz Holtzman, who was on the Judiciary Committee during Watergate, giving us a talk about the comparisons. And in fact, she just wrote a nice report for Common Cause that we'll be putting out soon, and it's fascinating. We are absolutely at a Watergate moment. And I'm also, oh, poor Adam, going to have to disagree with him, because even though Jeff doesn't like polling, our polling shows that 68% of New Mexicans, when they go to the ballot box, are thinking about campaign finance reform. And if you champion campaign finance reform, they're more likely to vote for you. So how about disagreeing with both sides? No, but I think that there is the appetite. People want it to happen, and people want it to be done in a way that protects what we have now and looks at the future, goes back to pre-Buckley. I mean, let's talk about spending limits again. You know, I've never gotten to work on spending limits because they've been unconstitutional forever, but that's what people want. People want I mean, if you can't spend $400 million, you don't need to raise $400 million.
Okay. Others?
I'm starting to feel like the member of the Federalist Society on this panel. Wait a second.
Well,
I'm with you on the con.
I'll jump in. And on the Watergate question, no, I actually don't think it's a Watergate moment. And here's why. I think Watergate and what happened after was actually the end of what was an amendment era. So I think the question is, are we in the time when Americans rally to do unbelievably big structural change to fulfill the promise of America? That wasn't the 1970s or 80s, but it was the 1960s. I mean, we did 4 constitutional amendments between 1963 and 1971. Now, Adam says they don't count or they're not important, but if you're 18, 19, or 20 years old getting drafted to go to Vietnam, I bet you cared a lot that you got the right to vote because of a constitutional amendment. If you were in the District of Columbia with no representation in Congress, I'll bet you actually appreciated the 24th or 5th Amendment. You know, if you were in the civil rights struggle or just believed that it's wrong that the poll tax is used to keep people away from voting, I ostensibly because of their economic means, which is bad enough, but being used to suppress the votes of African Americans, I'll bet you liked the 26th Amendment a lot, which ended the poll tax. So we did these things in the 1960s. And, you know, in a lot of ways, post-Watergate was an attempt to continue. You know, the campaign finance reform and the other reforms that came out of that, the reason they ran into trouble on the court, there's a book about it, Corporations Are Not People, but basically, you know, Lewis Powell had been appointed by Nixon, and although Nixon went, the court had been set up to start the road down to Citizens United, and the moment was gone. So my bet is we are in a much better situation, and because we're in a much worse situation than Watergate. We are in the kind of situation in this country where democracy's on the line. You know, in the 60s, cities were burning, horrible civil rights strife, terrible illegal war, president driven from office and corruption, all kinds of things that really raise the question about, is American self-government really serious? Is it really going to be able? And that's what happened in the between 1913 and 1920, 4 more amendments in that era that basically created the 20th century. You know, it happened after the Civil War, it happened after the Revolutionary War and the failure of the Articles of Confederation. So my bet is we are actually in a worse moment than Watergate, because the question about America's promise that we're actually going to be a self-governing republic is really on the line for real. And if that's true, then we are going to see, and I hope we'll all help, create the kind of historic moment that when we look back, there'll be 3 or 4 amendments and a whole host of reforms, as there were in those areas, that come with amendments and kind of reset the promise that we're going to actually make this work.
If you have questions and you're in the audience, we have cards on your seats. You can write one down and pass it forward, and we'll try to get a few of them in. Go ahead.
Yeah, so, but Char, you asked about the tie to Mueller and this administration, and I certainly hope that none of this gets associated with the struggles that we are rightly having about Donald Trump. Because if this gets associated in a partisan way, that is a certain guarantee we don't prevail. I mean, it's the one thing that we've forgotten and we've lost the ability to do in America, and that's to engage in constitutional politics. And what I mean by that is the recognition that constitutional politics has always, except for one time, been cross-partisan. And the one time was the Civil War. And, you know, some people want to have a civil war, but I'm not seeing many advocates for another civil war. So we have to remember that every single amendment since the 15th Amendment was endorsed by both political parties prior to its being adopted. And so that's why the commitment to find a way to talk about this that can include people from both sides. And remember, this president was the first Republican on a debate stage who called out super PACs as an abomination and something that had to be eliminated. Now, of course, none of us really believed him, but still, he triggered in the Republican Party an extraordinary number of Republicans who said, yeah, let's drain the swamp, which is actually a slogan from Nancy Pelosi. He didn't know that at the time, but let's drain the swamp and end the power of big money in politics, because Republicans, too, recognize that this system is deeply corrupted. So I hope we have a moment in exactly the way that Jeff is describing, but it's got to be a moment that does not feel like a Democratic Party moment, because if it is just a Democratic Party moment, it's a pretty fizzled and failed constitutional moment.
And I just want to jump in, because that is so true. And I, you know, again, from a state's perspective, it's not a partisan issue. None of this is. I mean, we always make sure we have a Republican and a Democrat sponsoring our priority legislation. I like to tell a story of a couple of years ago, back when Occupy was still busy in New Mexico. I had a Tea Party rally on one side of the Roundhouse, which is our Capitol building, and I had Occupy one side, Tea Party the other side. I spoke at both rallies, and I used the same speech. Literally. I mean, so people need to understand it's the entrenched incumbent versus the rest of us. It's not Republican versus Democrat. I know that had nothing to do, but I was like, I had to give props out there.
Okay. So I guess it's a room full of lawyers. Who picks the delegates to the convention?
So the presumption is that the states are going to pick the delegates. And lots of people have lots of trouble about that. They also have trouble about the fact that you seem to vote. Many people think you're going to vote one state gets one vote, so there's lots of inequality built into that. But again, the point to emphasize is that all this is doing is throwing onto the stage amendments that states then have to ratify or not. So from my view, I'd love to have a better process for picking delegates. I'd like to have random selection of citizens to be delegates to such a project. But even if you have terribly invested and corrupted delegates, the most they can do is come up with amendments that don't get passed.
Okay, and here's a follow-up question to that, which is, Larry, your convention could pull a 1787 and not just propose amendments. That's how we got our present Constitution. Are you at all worried of it sort of spinning out of control?
Oh, I'm so glad I got that question. I thought you were going to make that argument, and I was going to have to be
No, I was
mean.
waiting for the
Yeah,
audience.
no, that's great. It's such a great question. No. Okay, no, really,
Why aren't you worried? Okay, this is where I'm
so here,
worried.
look. Here's why. Okay, so this is hard to compress, and I'm going to try to do it in exactly 60 seconds. But here it is. What happened in 1787 was this: a bunch of white elite men got together and wrote a constitution. There was nothing illegal about them doing that. It was completely permitted, but they did that. And in that constitution, they said that this constitution will be ratified when 9 state conventions ratify it. Now, they can say that too. There was nothing unconstitutional about that. But what they did then is send it to Congress and say to Congress, Congress, we want you to change the rules for ratifying an amendment to the Articles of Confederation and send this out to the states so that the states will ratify it according to these changed rules. Congress did that. Congress did the dirty. Congress changed the rules for amending the Constitution, and that's how we got our Constitution. Now, many people argued, is that illegal or is that unconstitutional? There's lots of good theory about why that constitutional convention was allowed to do that. But when people point to that precedent, what they've got to be able to say is the equivalent today could happen again. So what's the equivalent? So imagine Akhil Amar and Pam Karlan get together. They won't have like 50 white men. They'll have a nice diversity of people. They sit down and they write up, our democracy amendments or our representational integrity amendments. And then they send it to, let's imagine Nancy Pelosi is the leader in the House. And they say to Nancy Pelosi, here's our amendments to the Constitution, but Nancy, this will never get 3/4 of the states to pass it. What you need to do is to propose that this gets to be ratified if a referendum of 60% of Americans support it. And so then Nancy Pelosi sends it out, and she says, if 60% of Americans voting in a referendum support this, this will be part of the Constitution. Is there literally one person in this room that thinks that could ever work? That there wouldn't be an immediate case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would say, I don't care what the old Congress under an old Constitution did. You can't change the rules for adopting an amendment based on a precedent from a different constitution in a different time in a different Congress without a Supreme Court to review it. So I think that the political possibility that you could ever imagine Congress changing the rules for amendments explicitly, sticking, is, I looked it up on Google, exactly 0% chance that that could happen. 0% chance that that could happen. They could try, but the other side to this is, if we want to make sure that the other side, the people who are proposing an amendment for the balanced budget or people proposing an amendment to avoid, to abolish the abortion right or the citizenship right, if we don't want to hand them a weapon to use if it looks like they're not going to get to 38 states for their, I think, terrible amendments, we've got to stop talking as if Article 5 Convention project is the same as 1787. It is not the same. 1787 was a constitutional convention. It was a moment where we threw off the old Constitution and adopted a new one. This is simply a proposal for amending, and I think there's no doubt this Supreme Court would assure, and they've never said they wouldn't, they've just hesitated from doing it, they would assure that the project does not change the rules for adopting if, in fact, it's amended. I failed. That's more than a minute.
And I got to jump in
Yeah, go
real
for it.
quick.
Yes, please.
And I just think that there is not that much difference between the white guys that sat down in 1787 and our current state legislatures, Congress, our courts. I mean, we are a majority state in New Mexico, and we're number 19th for judicial people of color. And so I think that the idea, and when in New Mexico working on these amendments, I have Republicans and Democrats vote for the other guy's bill and literally say, because we're hoping to combine them or we're hoping to figure out a way. And so the idea that these guys are going to be the ones ratifying it and they're already trying to pull a fast one with their vote is one of the reasons why we think that, as one of my National Governing Board members says, why would you set your house on fire and then pray the fire department shows up in time?
Yeah, but let's be very clear about if there's a difference here. Because that's true about an ordinary amendment too. What we are talking about here is whether Congress could get away with changing the rules for adoption. Like saying instead of 38 amendments, 38 states having to ratify, only 60% of the states, or a referendum of 60% of the states. And the point that I'm trying to make in response to that really great question is there is no plausible story that would say that Congress, on the basis of the precedent from 1787, could change the written rules in the Constitution about how an amendment could be adopted. Whether you like an amendment or not, that rule will be 38.
Okay. Jeff, how do you respond to the concern that any new amendment would be interpreted by an unfavorable Supreme Court? Would this make an amendment moot?
It's another great question, and no one can give a easy pat answer that don't worry about that one, because we know that's happens. It's certainly what happened to the 14th Amendment, which was in the 14th, 15th Amendments were supposed to settle once and for all that Americans will be equal and have an equal right to vote. And we're still struggling for that, and we had 100 years of struggle for that because of Supreme Court decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson and others. So, there's no question that any amendment is subject to interpretation by the Supreme Court for good and for bad. And now we have a good string of equal protection clause, 14th Amendment cases that worked out very well if you care about equality in the country. But we had many that worked out badly, including economic ones like the Lochner era that created corporate rights under the Equal Protection Clause, and were striking down even the child labor laws were struck down under this theory of freedom of contract under the 14th Amendment, due process clause. So, yeah, can a bad Supreme Court make mischief with this good amendment? Certainly. Does that mean we shouldn't have a good amendment? No, of course. We should get the amendment, and then we'll do what Americans always have to do, which is make it stick. Make it, the amendment doesn't mean you just go home and say, okay, political equality's done, we're all represented equally, I'm glad I don't have to be a citizen and in the fight anymore. No, we and next generations are going to have to win this amendment and fight to keep it, just like all the other amendments, and the court will always count a lot for good and for ill. So I give no assurances about that, but I am very optimistic that this will prevail, and it will set us up to have a much better shot in that constant vigilance that we have to have. And again, of course, as Adam said so forthrightly, courts matter a whole lot, and they will after this amendment too.
Okay. Where does the panel stand on only publicly financing elections and zero private donations? So I'll take the moderator's prerogative. I am for public financing, but under Buckley versus Vallejo, it has to be voluntary. So the constitutional lawyer in me just reacts to it being mandatory. I don't think that would survive scrutiny in this court.
And so even if I agree with the constitutional analysis, even if we amended the Constitution, though, I think it's actually a good thing to have small contributions in a campaign. So I like the idea of voucher as the method of public funding, so that everybody gets vouchers and they use that to help fund campaigns. But I don't see any reason to eliminate the opportunity for small contributions, because that's not corrupting in the way that these tiny few contributions are.
Okay.
Well, we're actually doing both in New Mexico. We've had a very robust public financing system in the city of Albuquerque since 2005, and we are currently collecting signatures because even our progressive Democrats on the city council aren't interested in making races more competitive. And we've got to collect 20,000 signatures in the next 2 months to put a Democracy Dollars addition on our ballot, which will go along the Seattle vouchers. We stay away from vouchers. Everybody thinks school vouchers, and so we call them Democracy Dollars. And so we think that it's going to be both. We're very much, we're feminists. We want both and, not either or. And so we think that having that robust system where people give you $5 qualifying contribution and then you get it, it makes the most sense. It makes the most sense. We have great support for it. I've got support from the Chamber of Commerce for it. So this is not a partisan issue either.
Yeah, I'm in favor of public financing. I mean, you're absolutely right, Chara, that the current constitutional doctrine is not great for it, but I don't think that should be the basis upon which we determine whether it's a good policy or not. We got to think in the future and think forward. I do think at the end of the day, you want to know what song they're dancing to, find out, who's paying the band. And at the end of the day, we really need to know you're going to be beholden to the people who are financing you. It's not that you're some sort of always nefarious beholdenness, but it's just the nature of how money works, and it's, it happens to nonprofit organizations worry about making sure their funding sources are there. So it happens to anyone who wants that kind of funding. You've got to find out who's giving the money. And if the public's providing the money rather than individual donors, then they're less likely to be beholden to those individual donors. I'm not in favor of maintaining small donations unless it's a small donation system that's mixed with a vibrant and effective public financing system that enables candidates to raise enough money through the public financing system. One of the biggest problems with our campaign finance system today is not just the impact of money in politics, but how money in politics shapes the lives of legislators. So I asked someone who's I had a drink with here last night, who's always here at the ACS convention. I said, where's your significant other? And because she's always here. And it's some of you might know Kathleen Clyde, who's often here at the ACS convention. She's running for Secretary of State in Ohio, and she can't come here because she has to spend the entire weekend raising money, and it's just constantly on the phone. Now, granted, she's raising big money, and that's a problem because there's big money donations. But if we didn't have a vibrant public financing system, and then we said, okay, you got to raise it through small contributions, well, the smaller the contributions, the more time they're spending fundraising to get enough money to run the campaign. So small donors with public financing, okay, as long as there's enough public money. But if you don't have the public financing part, then small donors is actually a move in the wrong direction, I think.
Yeah, and let's be clear. I don't think there's any disagreement on the panel.
No.
Because vouchers, as I call them because Republicans like that word and I want Republicans to support it, vouchers are a form of public funding. It's like public money that's out there. And if you get the numbers right, actually even under the existing system, people opt into it. So Connecticut, when it adopted its small dollar system, which is not mandated small dollars, but actually using small dollars to create public funding, 78% of existing representatives opted into that in the first year. So get the numbers right, people can steer into it even under the current system, but I think we need a mandatory system to eliminate that.
Okay. And we're nearly at the end of our time, so I'm going to ask the final question to all of you, which is, what gives you hope about this moment?
I would say the thing that gives me hope is that we're here, is that we're trying to think about the future, is that we're organizing, is that the one downside, I mean, there's a lot of downsides to Citizens United, a lot of downsides to Donald Trump being elected, a lot of downsides to what's going on in politics right now. But one of the positive things is the mobilization, the way in which I see it in my students, that I've thought for so many years my students are so politically apathetic. They're not apathetic anymore. Now they want to do something. They want to get involved, that they want to really fight. And I think the fact that the left is starting to mobilize a little bit and starting to fight and to think about these values in a really aggressive way, I think that's the silver lining in what is obviously a very, very dark, stormy cloud that's raining on us constantly.
Okay, Vicki, what gives you hope?
The people give me hope. We have so many members and people who've gotten involved and who've been involved for so long, and that this really matters to them. And, seeing the wins that happen in the states every single day, in localities every day, when I stand there with Republicans, Democrats, and Libertarians, session in and session out, and see movement going forward. Our founder, John Gardner, had a great quote that I will obviously be paraphrasing, that says, society is not like a machine that you just build and you're done with. It's continually being recreated for good or for ill. Now, some people, that's going to be a burdensome responsibility, but for others, it will call them to greatness. So when I'm in a conference like this, right after the justice's speech, so, if I was at this conference, I would have gone and had a cocktail and, dealt with it. To see this many attorneys in this room caring about this issue, working in your states, that's what gives me hope. It's taking all of us, we're rising to greatness every day to save our democracy.
Go ahead.
Well, I would agree. You know, Winston Churchill is said to have said, like many things, not everything you read on the internet is true, as Abraham Lincoln said.
Right, yeah.
But I think Winston Churchill did come close to saying Americans always do the right thing after exhausting the other possibilities. And I think, so what gives me hope is history, because God, we're not the first generation to live in a really tough time, you know. If you look at American history, my friend Bill Moyers says, democracy in America has always been a really close-run thing where we almost lose it over and over. But then we buckle down and we do incredible things like constitutional amendments, among other things. And I see that now, just like Adam and Vicki do. You know, we started American Promise to get this over the finish line, cross-partisan, locally based, in the states, effective strategy, all the things we thought the amendment work was not, were still gaps, even though there's so much good work had happened until that point. And we've just seen amazing growth. We've gone from 0 to 250,000 people in 50 states. Now, Wyoming, let me give you just 2 states, Wyoming and Massachusetts. Wyoming voted 68% for Donald Trump. Massachusetts, almost the exact opposite for Hillary Clinton. In both states, where we're quite active, we have hundreds of volunteers gathering hundreds of thousands of signatures to put this amendment on the ballot in 2018 and 2020. That is not uncommon. We're seeing it all over the country. And it's hard. If you have ever gone out to gather signatures for a ballot campaign, that's, you know, hundreds of thousands of conversations about the Constitution that non-lawyer volunteers are having. And so nobody can convince me that people don't care or that this isn't a really remarkable moment in American history where we can really make some transformative change. So those people inspire me. The history inspires me with hope. And this conversation, I've been trying to get Caroline Fredrickson to bring the amendment to the ACS for years, and I think the fact that it's ripe, and I think it is ripe now, and maybe it wasn't ripe before, fair enough, but I think it gives me a lot of hope that we're having this conversation, because we need smart lawyers and hardworking citizens in this effort. And as you hear, there are a lot of questions to answer, and the American people will answer them, and I think mostly we'll get it right as we have before. So I'm hopeful.
Larry?
So the first thing that gives me hope is that Adam is so completely wrong about whether...
That's not new, that's, by the way.
About whether the people care about this issue. The people deeply care about this issue. And the second thing is that I think the people are coming around to recognizing that they can't rely on their politicians to solve this for them. That the most important thing we need to recognize is that we have to build a new kind of political infrastructure, maybe temporary, but we've got to build the infrastructure that I think ACS that American Promise is doing, that Common Cause has been doing for more than 40 years, to build the infrastructure to force them to do the right thing. And that recognition is critical, because once people imagine it and they see that it's actually possible to do it, then their deep passion that we find a way to restore this corrupted democracy will have voice and actually, I think, manifest itself. And that I'm incredibly hopeful about.
Okay. Thank you. So I was told when I was at the Brennan Center that I had the perfect mix of cynicism and hope to do money in politics work. And what makes me hopeful is the bumper crop of new candidates, especially female candidates. Woo! So join me in thanking the panel.